It's Cafe CLIL 16, Phil, welcome.
It is indeed, yeah.
And we're doing something a little bit different this time. We're going to do kind of a news update. I've called it an Eye On CLIL, just to give it a subtitle. We'll see how that goes. We might change it at some point, I don't know.
Yeah.
And I wanted to start with, you mentioned being a Basque speaker, the early days of struggling to express yourself in Basque in meetings with colleagues in the medium of Basque. And one of the things you mentioned was that it was the logical connectors or the connectives that were missing in your speech. You couldn't join two clauses together very easily. And
right.
And curiously, this language and literature in science education, Jerry Wellington, Jonathan Osborne, have a focus on that very thing. I mean, they talk about the logical connectives being one of the hardest things for children to master in their productive science language. And they even grade them in 3 levels: easy, medium, and difficult. And the fact that that's such an important factor, of course, because causality in science is a crucial thing, not just cause effect. It's about observation. It's about seeing results, hypothesizing and then testing and going back to re-hypothesize and test again. So that the connection aspect of science is crucial for being fluent in science language.
Yes. Yes. I was talking to Brazilian guy the other day on Zoom. He's a master's student, and he's a coordinator in a school in Brazil, and he was talking about Bix and Calc, but he said they don't talk about it so much there. They talk about 3 tiers: first tier, second tier, and third tier. And the connectives would be kind of second tier, because they, in the terms of Calc or academic language, they're sort of general transversal academic language, but without them. I mean, they become particularly prominent in science, because you're usually explaining, and you're usually you're talking about causes and consequences. And so he was saying that would be described as kind of second tier language. Third tier language would be the absolutely specific discourse that's exclusive to science, but it's quite interesting difference.
I mean, Wellington and Osborne, it's 2001, the publication, it's a while ago, but they describe a project for publishing science books with simpler language. And one aspect of that simplification was taking out the logical connectives. And of course they question that. Of course they do. How can you understand the logic of processes, the logic of cycles, the logic of causes and effects without the language that joins aspects of those concepts together?
Yes, no, absolutely. I can't imagine any kind of scientific discourse not having those connectors, particularly the consequential ones. This leads to, this results in, etc., etc. But again, it's the kind of language that you don't use in the playground, is it? You might say so, but you don't. It's just not there as a natural process of people's discourse.
I've made a screen capture. I'll put it in the clip later. Of the 3 levels of logical connectives in kind of flow of difficulty, what would you say is the most difficult connective that you can think of? Can you guess?
Do you mean a linking conjunction?
Yeah, a linking word. Yeah, a linking word.
Good one.
I think you actually mentioned it. I think you actually mentioned it when you were talking about you talking in Basque. Moreover.
Moreover. Okay. Furthermore. Yes, that kind of thing. Yeah. Gañera in Basque. That's right. Yeah.
And the other one that they've italicized in this visual that I'll provide is conversely.
Oh, nice. Yes. Because again, conversely, if you think about it, it requires you to have been fairly logical before you say conversely, because you've got to give the correct converse, as it were, the correct obvious. Yeah. Furthermore is the same, isn't it? Furthermore requires you to have said something fairly logical just before,
Yeah. I mean, I think what CLIL does with language like this is makes it visible. The teacher's aware that it could be problematic, but it also creates context for practice. And I think that's significant in a pedagogical sense, that we know that this is going to cause problems, so we prepare for it, and it's going to turn up somewhere. It may be that these phrases are on cards, and we play with them during an activity, so that learners get to practice introducing some of these more complex academic terms in their classroom language.
Yeah, where it gets a bit tricky is when you get connectives, for example, that tend to always begin a sentence and not link a sentence. However tends to be however tends to start sentences. I'm putting myself on the line here by saying that, but and furthermore possibly as well, unless you say and furthermore you could continue, but that's quite sophisticated, isn't it, syntactically?
Yeah.
Actually, just talking about these, just riffing on this point, it just might be useful. I'm doing a coaching thing with university teachers here at the moment. I have individual teachers on coaching, about 3 sessions. They tell me their problems and we try and work them out, and I was certainly for lecturing, and we were talking about lecturing the other day, and I said I was talking about what's called a change up after about 20 minutes of an hour's lecture, where it's been researched that students or the audience's attention starts to go down, and particularly if it's being done in a second language, that's even it's been researched at about 20 minutes in,
Right.
And so, well, you can do various things. You can do a little dance, and we were talking about what you could do as the change up. But I said, have you ever noticed that when you use the word however or nevertheless in a lecture, all the students suddenly look up and they start paying attention? And I always ask I say, why do you think that is? And because it's obvious, because if you say however, the student looks up and says, oh God, what were they saying before? Because there's that, as you say, connective. If you're going to listen to the next part after however, if you haven't been paying attention to the previous part, you've got a problem, and you've got to start copying off your mate with the notes, or you've lost it. And so it's that very simple making people aware of the power of certain bits of language when they're not language teachers. Why do you think however is a powerful thing? Or furthermore, you've got to be careful with them, but when you use them in a lecture, use them carefully, stick a bit of intonation in there, and really make the student sit up, and they realize that something has gone before, and they've got to understand that to now understand the subsequent information. Simple stuff, but we don't think about it, do we?
There's another article I picked up from a colleague called Lauren Bartholomae, and it's called Sensemaking and Multilingual Learners in Science. There's a bit of a pattern to some of the things I've gathered today, and it's a really nice resource mentioned in the article. I'll put the link in the notes, where science has moved in this particular context from learning about to figuring out. And I think what this colleague is writing about is giving tools to learners so that they're able to share with each other and work out with each other what's going on around them. And that also relates to language. I think that's particularly important in what we're talking about, is whatever the content subject, we're talking about communicating our understandings. And I think that CLIL is all about creating those situations to allow children to learn from each other as much as from the teacher.
Well, we were talking about, CLIL now, aren't we? And this is part of the reason for today. And I like, one thing I do like that emerged from, the let's say the more recent models of CLIL, or model of CLIL. We can talk about that subsequently. But one thing that's emerged is this phrase languaging. I do like that. And at first I thought, what the hell? And then the more I've got into that phrase and read about it, the more I like it. Languaging is exactly what you're talking about. Languaging means the ability to see the function of language in subject disciplines. I mean, a student to see it. And also the ability to reflect on that language also linguistically. You see what I mean? So we know what we might know what photosynthesis means and we can talk about it. It's a noun. It means a certain amount of things, but also to see the function of however, to
Yeah,
understand as a student, to understand that, okay, like my discovery in Basque. Now, if a
yeah,
student can do that, that's what's known as languaging. I kind of like that, and I
yeah,
suppose again that's part of what we call the the plurilingual package, not so much the multilingual package. Again,
yeah,
that's a nice contrast that's emerged, I think, in this sort of later period of, well, not just CLIL, but more this
yeah,
idea of literacy, Yeah,
yeah,
just kind of academic literacy, it can't exclude language. However, it
yeah.
could never exclude language, but I like the way that maybe we're getting more conscious of that now, that's maybe
A couple of things I've written down from Wellington and Osborne is something I'm sure you'd like here. They've got these three principles that their book is based on. Learning the language of science is a major part, if not the major part, of science education. Every science lesson is a language lesson. Number two, language is a major barrier, if not the major barrier, to most pupils learning science. Three, there are many practical strategies which can help overcome these barriers. It's almost a kind of mantra for CLIL, isn't it, that three principles?
completely and completely. And I actually, Keith, yesterday I was looking again at the WIDA stuff or the wider stuff, the WIDA.
Okay.
I mean, you've looked into it perhaps in more detail than me, but I just kind of randomly shot down that very long document of theirs where they break down the language demands of curriculum subjects right across the curriculum, and I just happened to come on to science. I've got it here, and it was absolutely brilliant, and it's so clear, it's so available and so accessible, I think, to a teacher, and in order to make that salient to a student, it's extraordinary that that's come out of Wisconsin. Nothing against
It is
Wisconsin, but
extraordinary. I mean, no disrespect to the colleagues in Wisconsin.
no, no,
It's a wonderful project that they've created. The idea of a whole curriculum audit of language and then guidelines for teachers in
yeah.
subject-specific areas, how and what to do to support their learners' academic language.
I've got it behind me here, Keith. I'm just looking at I remember it was, I mean, you could pick any page really, but what I like is also the way it's set up very clearly. It's also very well organized, and it's not a document you would read the whole thing,
Sure,
but
sure,
I've just
sure.
got this yeah, they've got it through curriculum standards, and they've gotten right through the cognitive ages. I think this is grades 4 to 5. um, um, it's probably page 156. I knew I'd get this wrong, but keep going anyway. I'll come back to it.
Related
I just
to
wanted to,
WIDA, you jump back in when you're ready. There's
yeah.
another post I've picked up from a colleague, Priscila Costa, who it presents science lesson again, and it's based on the WIDA guidelines. So that's quite a nice example to put in, because she's got a really wonderful idea in her lesson to help learners produce full sentences. And she's got a poster with 4 verbs on the
Mm.
poster. And the verbs are simply are, have, need, and give. And it's about the life cycle of plants, caring for plants, which I've talked about quite a lot in my school context. And each of the verbs then has color-coded post-its for aspects of those descriptions that center around the verbs are, have, need, and give, for describing plants.
Yes.
Wonderful idea.
Yeah. Well, I've got this up again. Well, I think what's brilliant about WIDA, if any teacher looked at it, it would be helpful for them because it enables them to see how
Yeah,
it enables them to see more clearly the relationship between language and content. Now,
yeah,
that's
yeah,
the big point about it. But the way they
yeah.
break down stuff, and it's sort of stuff we've talked about, particularly. I mean, this was the page I just uh, came onto randomly yesterday, and
Okay.
it says grade 6 to 8, WIDA ERD standards. So language for science, right? It's still science, and it says, and it's categorized it by just saying argue, so we come back to the CDFs, we come back to argumentation, the cognitive discourse function. So argue, okay, that's great, and then it's got this little yellow box and it says language expectations. I say language expectations. What are the expectations of this argumentation at
Yeah,
this cognitive level and age level?
yeah,
Uh, Multilingual learners will dot dot dot, and it
yeah,
says identify convincing evidence from data models. Again, look how it puts the procedural, let's say, or even the discourse function, identify convincing models. Compare reasoning and claims based on evidence from two arguments on the same topic. Evaluate whether they emphasize similar or different evidence. Introduce and contextualize topic phenomena. Support or refute a claim.
yeah.
Establish as verbs. Now, signal logical relationships among reasoning evidence data. Boom. There you go.
Yeah.
There you go. I mean, kind of what more can a
What
teacher
grade was that? You
want?
said, what grade was that? You said 6?
Grade 6 to 8.
Right,
You
right,
know,
yeah.
it sounds tough. It sounds like high level stuff, but it's not. That's exactly what
That's
students at that level
exactly
have
what
to
it
do
is.
if they're doing science. That's what they have to do. You know. Then it breaks down the language functions and the sample language features. I mean, we can put this up. We can just put this
Yeah,
page up later if you want.
let's paste it in
But
and link as well
it, it, it,
again.
it's great stuff. It's a great resource for any teacher. It's
And I
amazing.
think in a way what the WIDA initiative, let's call it, is doing is putting language for learning center stage, isn't it? It's expecting
Yeah.
teachers to develop an understanding of how language works within their subject areas. And I think that's crucial. You know, CLIL is not about immersion. And I think
No.
the WIDA approach is not about immersion either. It's about being explicit, isn't it?
Oh yes, yes. That was one of the discoveries of the famous Canadian project, wasn't it? That the immersion project that they said, well, immersion will take you so far, but in the end,
Yeah,
one of the big discoveries of the Canadian immersion project was that at some point you do have to get explicit.
yeah, yeah,
And because it's again that goes back to this idea of languaging. You know, in the end, your understanding of content
yeah,
is
yeah,
is 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 mediated by your understanding of language. And the
yeah,
more
yeah, yeah.
explicit that becomes, the better. That doesn't mean we have to talk about breaking down a passive into the object, subject, blah, blah. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the salience of that language, you know,
Yeah,
and the
yeah,
salience of this language, just those verbs, you know, identifying, comparing, evaluating, introducing, supporting or refuting, establishing,
sure.
signaling. And there you
Yeah,
go. Well, I also think that, Keith, that that's also important for a language teacher. If a language teacher were just a standard normal language teacher in working in an academy who wants to move on a little bit, if they just opened this WIDA document and went to page
yeah,
156,
yeah,
you
yeah,
go,
yeah.
okay, if I'm going to use content, if I'm going to use more content in my classes, what does that imply? You know, let me
Exactly.
just look at those. Let me just look at those verbs in that description. You won't
Yeah,
find that in an English language textbook. You won't
yeah,
find it. They're not based on English language textbooks are not based on cognitive discourse functions. However they
yeah.
might argue that they are, they're not. And it's just a different way of thinking about language education.
That's right. I want to mention another name I've come across, Dr. Ruslana Westerlund, this colleague who's kindly agreed to join us, Phil, at some point for a
Mm.
Cafe CLIL, which is
Yeah,
wonderful because
yes, it is.
Ruslana's one of the people at the creation side of the WIDA program. And she's got a website that looks at making language visible, basically.
Yeah.
And you know, it's quite incredible how on the pulse this stuff is for what we do for CLIL. And one of the things I'm going to share with colleagues is there's an article she's written about cause effect in historical texts, causality in historical texts. And then that links to a presentation she's done on causality in science. So again, linking to logical connectives and so on. But the crucial takeaway I got from reading these wonderful pieces was in a historical text, we have causality not just within an item, but from beginning to end of text. You know, you've actually got a whole sequence of causes and effects that appear in a chunk of text, and she describes this process as the domino effect. And she uses a volcanic eruption and the processes that happen, and she's got this visual that links all these processes together. And at each event within this sequence, causal language appears, you know, and both in processing that language and then producing that language. We always talk about input and output, don't we, in our CLIL materials. There needs to be things done to support the processing of the learners of that input, and then to scaffold the output of those learners to produce that causal language in their own words. So yeah, I'll share that as well.
I think maybe I think we mentioned this before. I think the science tends to kind of make CLIL issues a bit clearer. Not that CLIL is about science and science is about CLIL. It's just that if you teachers often ask me, Keith, they say, what are the best subjects for CLIL? If you get to some place that's starting up. Well, it's an interesting question, isn't it? And I came up with a few ideas to help on that. And And I think I can't remember the phrases I used, but science is a kind of it's a kind of visual, hands-on. It's the language is available from the very conceptual basis of science. The language is always available,
Yeah, I know what you mean.
Whereas if you look at social science, it's not quite so available because you tend to get denser texts, more diffuse text, maybe more, and so. The language of history, well, the past simple, but the language of history also, of course, you can break it down. You do tend to find often, certainly when you get down to primary level and the texts are not so long and dense, you also see a lot of logical connectives as well in there, and you see a lot of what we would say explanation. It's explanation that you might get description, explanation. So again, cognitive discourse functions help. But history is certainly denser. But again, one of the reasons why you might want to do CLIL in your school or your region would be that, well, you want that amount of language. You want a lot of language, and you get in history, you get a lot of language. And often history teachers in CLIL find that sometimes problematic. They find they have to break it down. So they have to use methodologies like jigsaw readings to break it down. Whereas science, in a sense, might not have that problem. The language is clearer, perhaps. And
I call it formulaic. The language follows certain patterns all the time, doesn't it?
That's right. That's right.
I think the most formulaic subject I have in my kind of range of subjects which have less peripheral language to more peripheral language is maths to social sciences.
That's it. That's the word I was looking for. Peripheral. Yes. Yeah, the social sciences tend to be, there's more peripheral language, isn't there? Yes, and so it becomes a little bit more difficult to identify. But that in itself is an interesting challenge, because then a student who's reading a long text has to learn the strategies of what you're looking for. You're reading a lot of stuff, but you're looking for certain stuff. Mathematics is the other end of the scale, isn't it? There's hardly any peripheral language at all. And that's been one of the reasons why it hasn't been taken up massively in CLIL, although Patrick de Boer, who we'll talk about in a moment because of his website, has come into CLIL through mathematics and has an interesting take on that. But again, it is interesting, isn't it? Physical education has been a bit controversial in CLIL because people say, oh, it's just commands. Well, it's not. I mean, there's obviously a wider conceptual base to physical education than when we were at school, but you certainly can identify these things, and so it's another way of thinking about CLIL, isn't it, in terms of what the subject itself gives to the language.
I think that's a good place to stop. That's our 30 minutes, and I think this is also something we can do again, Phil, because we pick up nice resources and articles and sites and things to share with colleagues. So let's stop there.
Okay.